Technology.
Technology, right, okay. Well, welcome guys, and welcome to everybody who is viewing, which apparently is 0 at the moment, but that number will hopefully increase. Otherwise, for everybody who's watching after the live event, thanks for watching. Right, so we've got Marco Altini from HRV training, or HRV training, HRV number 4 training. We got Mike T. Nelson from Mike T. Nelson everywhere on the internet. Fingers in all the pies. And we have Simon Wegerif, which I can never pronounce your surname correctly.
That time.
From ithlete, who's another UK-based person. And my name is Tom Herbert. I'm just a London-based personal trainer out here. So, guys, I think what we'll do is, starting with Marco, do you want to just give a quick background on yourself and why it would be good to actually listen to you today?
Yeah, sure. So, well, I have a background in computer science engineering. I have a bachelor and master's there. I have a PhD in applied machine learning. I am a scientist, a data scientist, I would say. I work for a startup here in San Francisco where we use wearable technology and work a lot on physiological data in the context of pregnancy. And I did a lot of work with similar technology and accelerometers and phones and physiological data in the context of monitoring activity and energy expenditure, cardiovascular fitness, heart rate variability, and I am also running HRV for training, which is an app which lets you measure heart rate variability using the phone camera or a chest strap. And I'm building, a lot of analytics on top of that to try to interpret this data and make more sense of the single measurements. So I guess that's why I'm here.
Good, good. And then Simon, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. My name's Simon Wegerif. My background is as an engineer. Originally, I was employed by the BBC in the area of digital broadcasting research. So my background is as an engineer in signal processing and in control systems as well. And I've since I was a kid, I've also loved cardiovascular physiology, and I've been a keen endurance athlete pretty much my whole adult life. And I first became interested in heart rate variability in 2008 when I read some Research Digest about it. And I could see at the time that it was something which was potentially interesting to help me improve my own training. But I couldn't find any consumer-friendly way of doing that that didn't involve quite a lot of time and quite a lot of money. So I basically started to think about that as a problem, and by the early 2009, I'd devised some techniques which subsequently have become quite widely used, and applied for some patents and got a first HRV app towards the end of 2009, and that was called ithlete, and it's been developed ever since. And yeah, it's hopefully helped about 25,000 people so far to improve the effectiveness of their training as well as their health. So it's a journey I've very much enjoyed so far.
Good, good. And then Mike.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Many years ago I did a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science, then decided to go do engineering. So did some post-grad work and then eventually did a master's in mechanical engineering. Unlike Simon, all my ESP and controls classes made me just quiver and run to more of the mechanical side and away from that kind of stuff. After I graduated, I worked for a biomed company for almost 14 years, more in the cardiology space. And during that time, I did about 4 years in a PhD program for biomed. Decided I didn't want to do that because I was trying to avoid any more math. So ran over to the exercise physiology department. So spent about 7 years there doing my PhD in exercise phys. And literally, like the first meeting I had with my advisor, he said, "We've got 2 new projects that both involve math." And he looks around the table and he points at me and said, "Hey, you math boy, these are your projects." That was metabolic flexibility and heart rate variability. So that's how I kind of just stumbled into that, and met Simon along the way, and been using the ithlete with probably, I don't know, a whole bunch of people now for about the past 4 years online. So
Okay. So you were using one of the older versions. I think I've only used the shiny new version.
Yeah, I remember teaching once when I was at the University of St. Thomas teaching, and I had it on the old Motorola Droid 1 phone, and it had this cool thing where you could broadcast your phone up on the screen. So I set the phone up there, and I had the ithlete, the early app on it, and everyone in class were just horrified because, one, they thought my phone was so old because it was 2 years old at that point, or 3 years old, and I told them that the cost of the app at that point I think was like $10. And they just lost their minds because they thought that was the most expensive app they've ever heard of in their entire life. So
Okay.
they're kind of used to getting things for free.
No, sure. Okay, so just for the benefit of time, but also the benefit of people who are coming into this for the first time, why don't you, Marco, take just a really quick overview of what HRV is, really just a few minutes. There's certainly links to my own article and other articles out there and videos about what HRV is, but if you could just give a very quick overview.
Yeah, sure. So what we measure basically with heart rate variability is very briefly a proxy to physiological stress. So we try to get some insight on the autonomic nervous system. In particular, I would say what we can measure more reliably is parasympathetic activity, so the part of your body, of your autonomic nervous system, which is taking care of recovery and rest. And with some of these features we try to get an understanding of this parasympathetic activity as it is affected by many stressors, which are psychological or physical. For example, training is typically a big one. And that's why by measuring these variables, we try to get a feeling of the recovery you need, and use that information to understand overall stress load and adjust training.
Okay. So one of the first things I wanted to cover in this talk was both of your applications use the RMSSD metric. Maybe Simon, do you want to just talk about the two main metrics that are looked at in studies for HRV, and that's the frequency domain analysis and the time domain analysis. Maybe just a brief explanation of the difference between the two and why ithlete chose the RMSSD metric.
Sure, be happy to, Tom. This is something that when I started becoming familiar with heart rate variability, I spent a long time looking at, for instance, the 1996 Joint Task Force document, which basically listed, it was probably high teens or even 20 different HRV metrics that could be assessed. And initially, it wasn't easy to choose between them. What I was looking for, though, was a metric that was relatively easy to calculate, which was quite robust in the hands of regular users, i.e. outside of the laboratory, and was something whose physiological interpretation was quite well understood. One of the controversies about HRV has been the interpretation of these different indexes, and RMSSD was actually one of the best correlates with what they call vagal nerve activity to the pacemaker node in the heart. So this had been established basically by using invasive tests such as selectively blocking the activity of the vagus nerve and measuring that the effect of that on heart rate variability using measures like RMSSD. So RMSSD immediately was one that stood out. It was also one that, because of the maths behind it, it could be measured quite reliably over a short period of time. And my background, I spent about over 15 years in Philips consumer electronics, and one of the things that I wanted to achieve was a measurement that people would actually do every morning and be compliant in that. So being able to do this measurement in 1 minute was very important to me. So I was looking for a parameter that would actually be valid for that short period of time. Now, yeah, I mean, just very briefly on the frequency domain parameters, those are still used, certainly in the laboratory. They have a couple of, I mean, they're good in some respects. High-frequency HRV is a good way of separating out the parasympathetic component known as respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And that, in simple terms, is the change in heart rate that occurs when you breathe in and when you breathe out. So you can get quite a precise understanding of the frequency of that, which is the same as the breathing frequency, and its power using frequency domain techniques. But there are also some issues with it, not least of which is the fact that a lot of athletes breathe really quite slowly at rest, and there's a cut-off frequency for the HF band, which can sometimes mean that essentially an athlete's high-frequency HRV doesn't actually make it into the band, so it doesn't register. There are a number of interpretive issues with low-frequency HRV. It was at one time very much hoped by the researchers and medics that this would correlate quite nicely to sympathetic activity, but that turned out not to be the case, although it's a hope that still persisted, although it's actually been disproven on a number of occasions. We can talk more about that if you'd like to. But basically, RMSSD is something that can be measured over a short period of time, and it's quite robust for use outside of the laboratory, and we understand what it's measuring.
Right, right. And Marco, I haven't actually used your app directly because I don't have an iPhone, but you also have a breathing control in there. Do you want to just talk a little bit about how you're actually using the camera on your phone and how that actually works?
Yeah, this works using PPG. So basically, well, the principle is that you measure blood flow, right? Obviously, when your heart is beating, your blood is flowing, and then you can measure that easily in some parts of your body. Typically, the finger is one where this works quite well. You see also at hospitals they have pulse ox on their beds, you know, to measure simply heart rate and oxygen saturation. And we can do that also with the phone camera with some, let's say, signal processing on top of what the camera feed provides us, because basically by lightening up the skin, you can measure very tiny changes in skin color that you cannot see, but the phone can measure using the camera. And then by upsampling that signal and filtering it in a certain way, you can basically get to a beat-to-beat signal, which is as good as what you get with a chest strap or an ECG. So we did several validations of this technique, and that's pretty much what the app does, which is, I think, similar also to what you have in ithlete with the separate sensor, right, Simon, with the finger sensor. It's a similar principle, which is PPG and blood flow, and that's what you measure and what you relate to heart activity. So it makes it a bit more convenient for people to use because you don't need to, you know, wet the chest strap and wear it early morning.
Right, right. Thanks. Okay, so basically we have the technology there, and we've basically decided on a metric, on a measurement that we can do in a very short period of time. I believe both of your apps it's a 1 minute measurement, right?
Yeah, you can configure it, but typically I think almost everyone uses 60 seconds because, you know, no one has the time in the morning. But yeah, that's I think, yeah, as Simon said, when we use RMSSD or any variant of this feature, one of the upsides is that you can do that reliably on a short time window, which you would not do with frequency domain features. So, and also another interesting property of this is that if you change time window and want to measure a bit longer, or you want to compare with studies where they measure for 5 minutes or things like that, this feature is not time dependent, so you can still take the insight from literature and apply it to your own case using the app, because everything is basically independent of time, and that is one of the big problems, I would say, with frequency domain features, where it's very hard to take the knowledge in the paper and apply it to your own case, because features are always computed slightly differently. There is a lot more steps in processing these features. They can be normalized, not normalized. So I think by narrowing it down to this time domain feature, which is also, interestingly, the one that has been used the most in the past, I would say, 3-4 years by the sports science community. I think we are finally making some progress also in, getting more consistent results and getting results that we can compare and also implement in tools that people can use.
Right, right. So both of you, I think, will request people to take their measurements either first thing in the morning. Marco, I don't know if people are you're also taking measurements after training, and if your app allows that. I know the ithlete doesn't really. I mean, you can take it, but you'd want to have a consistent reading or consistent time of day.
Yeah, we use a similar approach, let's say, to try to keep things simple and sort of try to force the user a bit to use it when it's supposed to be used first thing in the morning, because that's the way you can make sense of the data in the long term. So, try to make it a habit and do it when you wake up. Try to, use always the same settings. And that way, then you will have more meaningful data. Then, yeah, we have other apps also that people can use to measure different time of the day and things like that. I think that's more like out of curiosity more than the actual use that you make of this data. You might go for a workout and then you want to check, and you do a recording, but if you do that like once or twice, and then it doesn't tell you much more than the direct effect of the stressors you just experienced, because in order to compare over time, you would need also to be affected by always the same stressor. Like you would need to train, for example, at the same intensity every time, and then you might use, for example, HRV post-training as a measure of recovery as well. But that's not the case. So eventually, the morning measurement, I think, is the one that is the closest to lab recordings and to control settings that help you actually making effective use of this data.
Okay, so basically, going back to the looking at the literature, when we look at the literature and we're seeing RMSSD being used, we can actually look at that and use that if there is any application, because we're also using RMSSD, which is a useful thing. Mike, bring you in. Have you ever done any readings outside of just the normal morning readings? Have you ever seen any use in that?
I mean, personally, I played around with it. For a brief moment in time, I tried to do like a workout using kettlebell snatches and tried to time everything and have it be basically like what Marco was saying, control the stimulus as much as possible and then measure HRV at different time points after that. Nah, it was more just for curiosity, not really useful. If you look in the literature, if people want to look at that sort of parasympathetic reactivation, looking at heart rate recovery is pretty much good enough, and then there's some debates we can get into about if you're extremely parasympathetic or very high trained or maybe even a little bit borderline overreached, your heart rate recovery may actually be really good. So it's not necessarily always good or bad, but it gives you a nice little marker, I think, that's much more useful than heart rate variability. Recently, I've measured it after some like hands-on work I've done on myself, just like massage type stuff, post meditation, more or less just to see if different things I do can shift it. The question with that though is how long does it stay? So, for example, I was able to do just some hands-on work on myself, went out and did 20-minute meditation, and my HRV in one case jumped like 16 points. And I tried to get it at the same resting heart rate as best that I could. So that tells me that those things were more parasympathetic. Makes perfect sense, at least with the meditation, because of the breathing and that type of thing. The question that we don't know, and I don't have enough data here to say just N1, does it really matter long term? Probably not, right? So you're back to doing some type of intervention and then just measuring HRV each morning, and then just kind of trying to sort out, what you think is the most effective. So if I do something that way and run it for maybe 4 weeks, I know that I can't control absolutely everything else in my life. So if it shows a positive effect, I'll wait maybe a couple of months and then I'll try it again. So I've got slightly different circumstances, but whether it's a supplement or meditation or whatever, and see does that move sort of the baseline in an upward direction overall. And again, it's still an N of 1. You're still kind of poking around and seeing what you find.
So, I mean, I think there's an agreement that with HRV, we want to try and keep everything the same when we're taking the readings. I know when I'm speaking to clients about it, I always ask them to make a kind of choice of what they're going to do before they take the reading. You know, if they want to go to the loo, brush their teeth first, and then sit down and take the reading, or do the reading first thing. I know personally myself, I try to go to the bathroom and do that first, and then come back to the room and sit. And I tend to get a slightly different reading. I seem to get a clearer reading in terms of how it matches what I actually feel. Sometimes if I do it first thing in the morning as I wake up, it seems to be more negative than what I can subjectively feel. Actually, that's a good segue. So both of your applications have subjective markers as well. So let's talk a little bit about, I mean, the whole point that we wanted to look at HRV is that there is a correlation with other factors. So does someone want to pick up a couple of those and give some other ones to some of the other people?
Sure, I don't mind kicking off a little bit with training itself. So with training, you know, one of the objectives of using HRV every morning is to see whether or not you've got any accumulated training-induced stress, which is going to be counterproductive to you doing a particular kind of workout that day. So what tends to happen is that, you know, our whole bodies are sort of wired with the autonomic nervous system to be able to activate our fight or flight response, which is the sympathetic nervous system, preferably for a short period of time whilst we're doing something intensive, and then to quickly revert to a parasympathetic dominant state, which is the rest or digest mode. And that's really what HRV is measuring. So it's measuring our current status of reversion to the parasympathetic dominant rest or digest state. So if we do a certain amount of training and we recover in time for the next morning, we can keep on doing that indefinitely. But if we're doing you know, either a programmed set of deliberate overreaching called FOR, or functional overreaching, then we can progressively see our morning heart rate variability readings will start to decline as the parasympathetic reactivation every morning becomes less and less effective, and that means that we're accumulating stress. And that doesn't necessarily mean your performance is going to decline, and that's something that I know Mike can expand on very significantly. This is something which is he's noted quite a bit. Doesn't mean your performance is going to decline, but it does mean that you're starting to accumulate a stress load which can't be sustained indefinitely. So I think I'll just leave mine there for the time being. So your HRV reduces progressively if you are accumulating an amount of training from which you're not recovering effectively. So that's a sort of stress recovery imbalance.
Right, and so for those listening, that would be indicated by a decrease in the HRV in the most part, right?
That's correct, yeah. In the first instance, yes. There are other effects that we can talk about which come along later, but in the first instance, it's nearly always a parasympathetic, a lack of parasympathetic recovery.
Right, Mike, do you want to pick up on some of those comments?
Yeah, so I agree with Simon that the nice part is you're looking at accumulated stressors in general, and that it doesn't necessarily acutely relate to performance, right? So when I first started doing this several years ago, I'd have people that would email me and be like, "Oh, my HRV was horrible today. I went to the gym. I got a new PR. Ah, you don't know anything." And it is true. Like if I take my little Jetta and I redline it, I can drive faster. right? The car will go faster, it'll perform a little bit better, but I can't expect to do that every single day and expect that it's going to keep doing that, right? At some point, there's going to be a pretty high cost associated with that, and at some point, I may just burn the engine and it's going to stop entirely. So you can push more and more, and like Simon said, if you're doing something where you're purposely trying to functionally overreach someone, then yeah, you will see HRV kind of trend down, right? So you're becoming more sympathetic or less parasympathetic, depending on how you look at it. And your performance may be okay for a while, but that's not going to continue. And what I've noticed too is that the recovery after you kind of crashed your HRV can take quite a while too. So what I like to do with most clients in general, unless we're purposely trying to overreach them, is have it be kind of auto-regulatory. Right, so today my HRV average is down more than what I would like. I feel okay, so I may just do some lighter, more aerobic-y kind of stuff. You know, yesterday was a moderate-ish higher volume training, nothing real hard, but it was like 27,000 pounds, somewhere in there. And normally I'm pretty good after that, so I'm a little bit lower than what I would be after that session. So instead of doing another strength-based session, probably just gonna take it a little bit easier today. So that's kind of my philosophy, that you want to have enough overload, so you want enough that you're getting those positive adaptations for the athlete or body comp or whatever you're looking at, but you kind of want to push, my bias is push the frequency as much as possible. So if someone had the option of 3 days of just going balls out or 6 days of more moderate, in almost every case, there's a few exceptions, I would take the 6 days of more moderate, right? And I can use their HRV to kind of guide them that. So if their Monday, Wednesday, Friday is all out, over time I'll try to decrease those sessions and then maybe add a Tuesday, a Thursday, or a Saturday session. Now some of that may be aerobic training, it may not be all necessarily strength training, but overall, looking at the weeks to months, I want to see the quality of work slowly going up, because I know that that's going to be associated to the better adaptations and getting them closer to their goal.
Right, right. Mark, do you want to just come in and maybe talk about a little bit on how aerobic training appears to increase HRV? I don't know if you've seen that, but certainly I've seen with a number of people, they can have low HRV, they do a lower intensity session, and even rather than having a rest day, for instance, and their HRV actually recovers far better.
Yeah, so on, well, just following up on what others were saying, I think the training load is definitely one of the factors we see consistently related to HRV, right? I think sometimes even when, let's say, the ones that are more skeptical about the measure, it's more about how to effectively use it, I think, than what it means and what it represents.
Right.
So I think there are two sides of this. One side is, okay, you measure physiological stress, which is a fact, and physiological stress is often due to training and training load. And another thing is, once you know this information, how do you use it? Like, so how can you effectively change your training plan so that you will eventually increase performance eventually? Because indeed, as Mike was saying, it's not that on a day that you have a low HRV, you will necessarily not perform well. But it doesn't mean that if you always push it when your HRV is down, eventually you will not, get to non-functional overtraining or overreach. So what we've been looking at also with I think, which is interesting, is using users' data to look at these relations. For example, we have a few studies where we see a reduced HRV after intense trainings, and we wanted to see if we could capture that relation also on a bigger user base, so that we can see if we have this relation consistently across many people of different ages, men and women. So, you can start to see, is this a relation that applies only to these athletes in these studies, or is it something that everyone can use even when measured with an app at home? So we could capture this relation. Clearly something we published recently, and I think it's other evidence that supports, the first step, which is, okay, you measure HRV, you capture training load. After more intense workouts, your HRV is reduced, and then how do you use that to, effectively increase performance as you go towards, a competition or your goal in general. Okay, so if we look then at how this data has been used by others, we have conflicting results, I would say. At the very beginning, the simpler approach was you measure HRV, and if your HRV is not good today, you don't train, or you train at a lower intensity. This was one of the earliest studies, which was successful in the in that single study. They basically guided training based on HRV, and the group that was trained this way eventually achieved better performance. But then this study failed to be replicated. And there was, let's say, for the following years, it was a bit more complicated to find a way to actually use this data effectively in a way that was not just, let's say, a case study. We often have case studies. We look at an athlete and we look at how things change, and thinking, you can always find ways to explain what you see, but that's different from designing a study in which you have people actually going through different training plans based or not on HRV, and then see how performance changes. So we had an interesting study recently by, I think, Westerinen, which was where they actually gave different training plans based on HRV again, but this time it was not based on simply your daily score and your change from yesterday, but it was actually looking at trends, which I think it's something that we are starting to do now. Looking at what's your normal HRV score, what's your baseline, how things are changing with respect to what is normal for you, and then when things are not looking good, meaning that your baseline HRV is below your normal values, then that means that it's probably not the best period to start an intense training block. So that takes, let's say, a bit of a different view from a higher level in the context of trying to schedule training based on HRV. So small daily adjustments, but also looking at the baseline and how trying to understand the big picture, how this person responding to training. So this study was particularly interesting to me because eventually not only these athletes that use this HRV approach improve performance more than the controls, but the interesting part, I think, is also that they train less eventually. So they had a slightly less workload because they couldn't always do all the intense training blocks because sometimes their physiology was simply not in the right place, but eventually they performed better. So there's a complicated study, and I think it's something that of what I would like to see more in the future in general is this kind of study with interventions with a bunch of people that really try to use these tools to schedule trainings differently and see what's the outcome. Because what we do normally is to make these small adjustments, but it's always hard to understand what would have happened if you were not following the advice or if you were following it differently.
Right. And I think that's one of the things which is probably lacking at the moment in a general understanding is the use of HRV in terms of periodization, or how you would use the HRV data and seeing the trends in terms of coaches planning things out, and even having an understanding of what the HRV should look like at various stages, and whether or not their athletes are appearing to match what they kind of predicted. Certainly, I think that's something that's going to come in the future, and having a kind of maybe a more of a general understanding of what HRV should look like in terms of the trending. And even though HRV is visual, as we know, certainly it would be good to understand what we should be expecting from the athletes. And that's good in terms of transitioning into that one study that Simon, you... oh, sorry, Marco, do you want to say something? No. Okay. Simon, so you did a write-up of Plu's study with the elite athletes, which was quite fascinating, and I know a lot of people use that study to kind of discount the usefulness of HRV because it's kind of ambiguous, certainly with the peaking and what was happening there. So do you want to just talk about that quickly?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I do want to sort of reinforce what Marco just said about future studies. We need to look at what we would call scientifically, I suppose, heterogeneity. So whether or not people all respond in a similar way to training programs. I think one of the problems with HRV studies around methodological issues has been that we can't still really tell whether people do really respond in a consistent way. So it would be great to redo some of the old studies on cross-country skiers and other things like that, using an up-to-date methodology like a consistent measure and things like that. But yeah, and in terms of like peaking and preparation, then a traditional periodized program would deliberately introduce an increasing load, let's say over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, and it could be that the trend is consistently downwards in HRV for that whole period of time. But then what we're looking for in the taper period, which might be a week or 10 days prior to competition, would be a reduction in volume, but not necessarily completely omitting any intensity work. And what we would like to see is a rebound in HRV, which is sort of consistent with the overall adaptation syndrome of supercompensation. So in simple terms, in HRV, what we would like to see is an overshoot of HRV beyond the previous baseline to a new level, but at the same time, we don't want to lose the body's readiness for fight and flight come the big day. So the intensity is needed to keep the adrenal system primed and ready for race day. Something that was interesting in the Plus study on the triathletes as well was a reduction in day-to-day variability itself. And I know that's something that Andrew Flatt has been exploring more recently. Now, in the example given, which was only an N=2 study on those triathletes, was a fairly serious downward trend in HRV, but also accompanied by a reduction in day-to-day variability. And that might just have been because that person's stress tolerance was hitting the end stops. Basically, their HRV was going to quite low values, and their day-to-day recovery was seriously impaired. They did end up putting in a poor race performance, and they needed a number of weeks recovery before they were able to return to normal training. But Andrew Flatt has also been looking at day-to-day variability as an indication of adaptation. So if the trend in HRV was sort of maintained at baseline or slightly above baseline level, in the kind of way that Mike was describing a couple of minutes ago, then a reduction in day-to-day variability for a given training load would tend to indicate that the athlete is becoming adapted to that training. So the training is not causing significant disturbance to homeostasis any longer. So actually what the coach needs to do is to change the training stimulus in some way, either introducing high intensity or changing some aspect of the training program makeup so that homeostasis and HRV once again becomes disturbed from day to day, and then a process of adaptation takes place.
Right, so from a coach's perspective, and obviously this filters down to someone who's doing it as an individual, we would want to see the baseline HRV over your training block to be maintained, and then from that increase variables so that it would be disrupted, and that would indicate whether or not you're driving enough of a stimulus. So in a sense, we are looking at reducing HRV potentially in that block. Mike, do you want to come in on that and explain maybe a little bit more?
Yeah, so my bias on that, so a couple things. I think it depends on your goal. So if you're a Olympic weightlifter, power lifter, something like that, you're not graded on how cool your HRV score is, or if you're a physique competitor or whatever. You're just using it as a means to an end, right? So in some of those people, unless they're super, super low, I may want them to go up to a certain level, which is very much individual. And then if it kind of erodes from there with training, I'm not too worried as long as it doesn't get too far down, right? So a lot of the programs I write, so for example, I had a program for a power lifter, and he could do pretty high amounts of volume. We did a fair amount of specific work, and he would go 4, 5, 6 weeks. We would kind of taper him for about a week period where his HRV would go down and then would slowly come back up. So like Simon was saying, at the end of that period, I kind of want his HRV to be almost back to his baseline again. That tells me, one, he's going to have capacity if his HRV starts going down again, right? He's not going to run into the basement. And then two, that the tapering period, we've probably done enough stuff where we've gotten rid of that accumulated fatigue. And in terms of peaking, what in a perfect world, like we did his peaking stuff before he qualified for Raw Nationals, and it was a little bit longer than what he had historically done in the past. So we started, it was like 12, 13 days out, and just really just aggressively slashed his volume pretty low, kept the intensity relatively high. So he's working up to 85, 90, 95% of 1 rep max, but very, very, very low volume, just some couple of easy days. So even like Wednesday-ish before a Saturday meet, he's just walking into the gym, hitting openers, and leaving. And in a perfect world, you'd want to see HRV, because of the accumulated stress, is going to go down. It's going to come up and recover. And then what I've noticed for strength and power sports is you ideally would want it to drop just a little bit more again, right? So they're not in that sort of parasympathetic overreach state. They are just a little bit more sympathetic, right? Because you think about what the activity of their sport is, you're going to have 9 attempts. You're going to try to hit 3 lifts, bench, squat, and deadlift at your maximum performance for a single rep. So that's, very high, sympathetically dominant. And anecdotally, again, I've only done with a handful of people because there's just not a lot of people that let me do that with their training and are willing to do it. So it's a small number, but so far it seems to work pretty good, right? And if you think about what you would do, even if you don't have HRV, you're still going to try to monitor what sort of accumulated levels of fatigue they have. You're going to give them some sort of taper or deload to try to remove that accumulated fatigue. Then you're still just trying to play around with timing. So I think HRV gives you some nice info on what is their autonomic nervous system stress so that you can kind of get a little bit more specific with that.
Right. And Marco, are you seeing that with, because a lot of your, you have more experience in the endurance sports world. Am I right in that?
Yeah, I mean, also the user base, I think it's up to 60% is probably cyclists and runners and triathletes. So it's mainly that kind of user. I guess also because historically that's where most of the research is, and also there is a clear link, between the intense aerobic exercise and this kind of reduction in parasympathetic activities. So they might find it easier sometimes to also see day-to-day changes and by themselves make use, effectively of these metrics.
Right. So say you had someone who say has got a race coming up, and they're new to HRV. Is it something, as both Simon and Mike have said, is that there is a point where you don't necessarily want to be parasympathetic dominant the day before the race, let alone in the morning? Do you think that then there could be things that could cause that, and actually for people who are looking at that HRV, maybe like in the Blue study, the week before the race, it's not a bad thing to have your HRV dropping.
Yeah, I think we are seeing some conflicting, I think, results also in there in terms of what to like. Normally, we would expect, I would say, the exact same cycle that Mike was talking about. You know, tapering, and you get your baseline to go up again. In some of these studies with elite athletes, we haven't seen that. They've been reporting that HRV was actually sometimes going down. I think one of the takeaways there is not to look only at HRV, obviously, right? So there is different variables that we need to look at. One variable that Larson and Bruce talk about is, for example, the fact that some of these athletes, they might saturate, which means basically that their HRV might not necessarily go up even when their heart rate goes down at a certain point. So you lose that linear relationship, let's say, and then one way to look at that is to look at another variable they introduced is basically normalized HRV or HRV divided by the average RR interval over the same time period. So by looking also at trends in these variables, they try to spot athletes that might experience this phenomena, and then in certain cases in which then this normalized HRV is either not, let's say, it's either trending down or not changing. In that case, they say a negative HRV baseline is not a problem. So it might be that you're simply in this situation and it's not something to worry about. Otherwise, it might be that you're not actually getting in the state you would like to get. So I think the important points are, yes, we normally expect tapering to bring HRV up. That is not always the case, and it's important to look at things in the right context. For example, definitely training load, but also the possibility that, especially for elite athletes, I would say this probably is something that doesn't happen frequently outside elite athletes, because also you need to have very low heart rates. Then in that case, it might be a good idea to look at this ratio with normalized HRV and see how is that trending before you approach the competition.
Right, right. And that's, I mean, that's something as well that I put in my article. I put a number of quotes from people saying that HRV is just one metric that could be useful, and you should not be looking at it as a means to tell you whether you are so-called overtrained or edging into the kind of non-functional overtraining. You know, there's a whole myriad of other things you need to be looking at. I think HRV, where it is most useful, and I've seen it, and I've used it in this sense, is for that trend, is to look at that, and sometimes you can spot it before the athlete or the client does. And I think that's a better way of using it, rather than using it as a kind of a gospel number that's going to dictate exactly what you're going to do or where you're going, to factor in other things. And it's certainly almost everybody I've worked with tends to say that the HRV score is telling them what they already know, and that's quite interesting. I mean, Simon, do you want to just talk about your the ithlete Pro quadrant map? That came out, what, about 6 months ago or so?
Yeah, it was a little bit longer than that. But what it really does is something that I had in mind for quite a long time, and that was to first of all to normalize people's data onto a chart where they weren't necessarily just focusing on the number alone, but they were looking at the significance of changes in their HRV, so both day-to-day changes and trends, basically plotted out over what we call a Z-score. So that's the number of standard deviations. So that's something that's normalized to their own variation. And we basically plot the HRV against the average RR interval as well. So as Marco was just describing, the relationship between HRV and essentially the resting heart rate is an important one, not only for saturation, but also looking at effects such as co-activation of the autonomic branches or co-inhibition as well. So it used to be considered that when parasympathetic was becoming dominant, sympathetic receded, and vice versa. But that's not always the case. And there have been some studies done both in athletes and people like skydivers as well, who are thrill seekers, looking at almost flow-like states where you've got co-activation of parasympathetic and sympathetic at the same time. And co-activation can actually be a state which is particularly conducive to good performance, because you've got the reserve that having a relatively high HRV implies, but you've also got the activation of the sympathetic nervous system ready for the fight or flight or the high power lift or the, you know, the very focused mental activity. So that's a nice way of looking at it. I would fully agree, though, that as well as sort of triangulating the physiological variables, we do definitely need to take the subjectives into account. So fatigue in particular, muscle soreness to some extent, sleep quality, other things like that are important to take into account both for the coach and for the athlete themselves, but partly also because you can identify lifestyle factors which are holding back the athlete from their true potential. I mean, some people, I want to pick up slightly on this point of HRV telling you what you already know. I think sometimes that's the case, and sometimes that can even be helpful in confirming how you feel. But I personally think that HRV is a nice indicator also, because a lot of the time it does confirm, but perhaps 1 or 2 days a week it will deliver you a message which is slightly counterintuitive,
right,
and either in a positive or negative way. And often it does prove to be true later on in the day. So you can get up in the morning, you can feel quite tired, but you have a good HRV, and later on in the, you know, by mid-morning, hey, you know, everything's fine. Conversely, you can have a situation where you get up and you kind of feel okay, relatively alert, but later on in the day, you know, you get a relatively low HRV or maybe an unusually high HRV indicating you're parasympathetic dominant, and later on in the day you can really feel quite tired, and I've certainly experienced those examples as well.
Right. Mike, do you want to just talk a little bit about either, say you take your HRV reading in the morning and it appears to indicate you might not be in an optimal place to train. Do you think there is a place where you can put interventions in throughout the day so that you can actually do what you had planned to do?
Yeah, so would I, if I'm not going to alter my training, what other things would I alter during the day? Was that the question?
You could do, yeah. Or even say you even it was a competition day and your HRV is low, even from a psychological, and this is another thing I actually wanted to pick up. I had this with a climber, and I had to chat with her a lot about this, was the psychological thing of HRV, and that because her HRV is low does not mean that she's going to perform badly.
Right.
So say you had a case like that, what could someone do to improve the outcome, even though they're not necessarily going to take their HRV again that day?
So a couple of things. So one of the complaints I've heard online is that, oh, I don't want to do my HRV before the event because if it's red, what if I do worse? So a couple of things. So that can happen. Hopefully, if you're following a good plan and you've been measuring HRV daily, you won't get into that situation.
Right.
The other thing I do with athletes is I tend to use a model of eustress versus distress. So I'm a big fan of pushing as much eustress as possible, so EUSTRESS, which is stress that your body can relatively easily recover from. And distress is stress that your body has a much harder time recovering from. So if, you know, powerlifters, again, just to use an example, classically known to dehydrate themselves to hell just to get down into a lower weight class. Sometimes Olympic athletes do that too. And sleep just a couple hours because their sleep is wrecked, and they get up next day, rehydrate, weigh in, boom, they hit like PRs, right? So that's a massive amount of distress on multiple levels, but they're able to do it acutely and perform well. Now, if you talk to them after that, they're probably not doing much for several days. A buddy of mine, Coach Phil Stevens, calls it the Olympic flu, he calls it, so you get sick pretty much every time after that. So it takes them a long time to recover that stress to get back to normal, because that was a very distress type of event. So in training, if I have enough space with an athlete, and let's say they get a very low HRV, and I'm looking at their heart rate, kind of using the graph that Simon talked about, and I think that they'll probably still do okay performance-wise, I may actually have them work up to a pretty heavy max, or even, if we've got enough time, even potentially set a PR on that day, even though their HRV score is kind of generally poor. Because that way, if it comes up to the event, say 8 weeks later, and their HRV, for whatever reason, a lot of times because they're very nervous about the event, things of that nature, they're in a new place, they got to travel, all sorts of other stressors, and it drops a little bit, I can then remind them of, oh yeah, remember when we did this, 8 weeks ago, and you went to the gym, and what happened? Oh, I got a PR on that day. Oh, perfect, cool. So I can refer them back to a similar event, and they had a positive outcome, right? Which is also, it kind of falls into almost a simulation type practice. So that's what I found tends to work the best. Second thing, to the second part of your question, if you're not able to do that ahead of time, trying to explain to them that HRV does not necessarily correspond to performance exactly. I may do things, especially if there's no weight class or they've already weighed in, dramatically increasing the amount of carbohydrates, better sleep, recovery, relaxation, meditation, anything just to try to get them to be more parasympathetic. But with most athletes, you're just trying to get them not to be stressed out about an event that hasn't even happened yet, right? And you watch athletes who are really good, they could sleep probably right before they go up and perform, right? Their ability to transition very hard is really, really good. Athletes who don't have as much competition experience, generally not quite as good with that. So yeah, you need to go sit in the corner and do some belly breathing for a while. Your handler will come up and get you and tell you when you're ready, right? You don't need to worry about anything else, right? So trying to get them out of their own head most of the time.
Marco, do you have any experience in a similar sense working with people, or?
No, I mean, the part of the work I do is not as a coach connected to athletes in that way. So I wouldn't know. Yeah.
Right. So guys, I don't know how good you are for time. If you've got a few more minutes.
I'm good for a few more minutes.
So I have a Google alert that pops up every time heart rate variability is mentioned on Google somewhere on the internet. And the frequency is getting huge now. It appears that a lot of consumer electronics or consumer fitness gadgets are starting to include heart rate variability. Where do you see, where do you see it in a general sense for people? Do you think it's actually going to be a useful thing for people, or do you think it's going to make it more confusing if there isn't, say, perhaps a standardized or even a standard understanding of the use or how it can be applicable? Both of you are early, whatever the opposite of adopter is, I suppose, producer of your HRV apps. Where do you see the future? Do you want to, Marco? Do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general it's definitely a very useful metric which relates to the overall load you have, and even just if you don't want to, even just to increase awareness on the choices you make and acute stressors and chronic stress over time. I think it's extremely valuable outside of training as well. So I'm hoping we are heading in the right direction with these tools being available to more people, and that also even for studies, like, things are much easier to measure now, so we can collect data for longer time on more people and get better insights and build better tools. So I think in general, like, there is a positive trend. At the same time, as you mentioned as well, like, it's a bit of a risk that not much is standardized, and it can be hard at a certain point to understand, especially for the consumer, why would I get this device instead of that device? Is this device actually measuring HRV? Everyone is making, many claims now with like wrist-based sensors, which typically cannot actually measure what we are measuring. So it's a bit complicated. Like also to understand why you can measure it with some devices and why you cannot measure it with others. If you don't have like experience on this kind of tools and pricing, and on the technical side of this, it can get confusing fast, and then easily you can derive the wrong conclusions. So some watches that even report RR intervals, for example, they report them even if they're not accurate. So which is even more confusing, because then you would say, use an app that computes HRV, and then you rely on the data that you get, similar to what you would with a chest strap, but it simply just is not measuring the same thing. So I hope, slowly we get also a bit more transparent on what everyone is measuring and how and what is accurate, and people try to spend a bit more time validating their products. But yeah, right now there is not much you can use and rely on and be sure that the information is what you need if you want to actually make use of this data.
And Simon, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Adding to what Marco says, I think validation is, I hope, going to become an important topic in consumer health products quite soon. I mean, we've seen some really bad results produced by popular consumer products. I'm not going to risk ending up the wrong side of a lawsuit by naming any particular ones, but there are some really bad pulse sensors out there, and they really ought to be performing either better, or they shouldn't be offering that function. HRV is a slightly tricky measure. It does depend on millisecond accuracy of measuring interbeat intervals, so it does need to be done properly. If it is done properly in consumer devices, it has the potential to be really quite helpful, not only to people who are exercising, but also people who just want to be healthier and live longer. I mean, HRV is a wonderful metric in as much as it's a leading indicator of overall health. It's really quite close to a health index in most situations, and there are, you said, Tom, there's a lot of internet traffic of people talking about HRV. I mean, not only traffic, there's more than 18,000 peer-reviewed HRV papers now in PubMed, and if we applied just a fraction of that to public health initiatives, we'd definitely be getting some rewards from that. I mean, just from a purely my own sort of biohacker point of view, I've been measuring HRV for 6 years now, and if we look at the chart of my baseline over that period of time, you can see I've basically gone on this particular log RMSSD scale, I've gone from low 60s to mid to high 70s. So I've been consistently finding ways of improving my HRV baseline over a period of 5 years, just by basically doing little experiments with myself, trying some things, finding out what works for me, what doesn't, and that is a voyage of self-discovery which everybody can go on, and that can be as simple as taking the dog for a walk after dinner, that can be as simple as changing something, in your diet, that can be, changing your drinking habits, that can be doing more exercise, or that can be things which, you didn't expect to give a good effect, like the belly breathing. My wife is a keen yoga practitioner, and she said to me, you need to do belly breathing, and I didn't take her seriously for a while until I tried it, and then I found my HRV was going up, and it was holding up as well. It wasn't just a temporary effect. This was something which was having some chronic impact on. I used to be, about 5 years ago, I was pre-hypertensive. I'm now like 120/75 or so, and holding very steady. So, some of the things I've done to HRV have later on had an impact on other autonomic measures like blood pressure, which take a lot longer to happen, but which are preceded by changes in HRV, and there's good research behind that.
Right, and I think some people miss that as well, is that there is a correlation between higher HRV and health markers, certainly lower mortality rates and things like that. And I think it is an indicator of the overall way your body is dealing with stress, and also the health of your cardiovascular system, I believe.
Definitely.
Mike, do you want to? I know whenever we chat, you always give me some kind of crazy correlative stories. Do you want to share the? I always remember the one of the coach with the athlete and being arrested. Do you want to share that story?
Oh yeah, it was. I won't name the coach who told me, but it just goes to show that everything is very specific to the individual. So a buddy of mine who's a coach was working with a pro athlete who will remain nameless, and was turned on the news in the morning, sees his pro athlete shows up on the news for not very good things involving the police and other things of that matter, and comes into the facility to train, and he's thinking, oh my gosh, this guy's he's going to be wrecked. You know, we're going to have to change his training. He does a HRV measurement. He was using a mega-wave in this case, and tests the athlete, and everything's good. Watches his movement. Everything, all indicators would say that this guy is pretty good. So he's like, well, I saw you on the news this morning. And the athlete's like, I don't care about any of that stuff. He's like, okay, whatever. So does a training session. Everything goes good. So a couple weeks later, same athlete comes in. Buddy's looking at him. He's like, that doesn't look very good. Tests him. All his measurements are crap. And he's like, well, what's going on? He's like, I got in an argument with my ex-wife on the phone on the way in. So this athlete, showing up on the news or ESPN for things that are not very happy, not a big deal. Having an argument with his ex-wife before going to training utterly destroyed him. So again, it's all very individual. So it's sometimes hard to, I'll get emails from clients and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is gonna, destroy their training because XYZ happened. Nope, training was good. Looking at their HRV scores, everything is good. Something else happens, which, because we all kind of internally sort of judge them based on our own, values, which I think we do consciously and unconsciously. Wow, that really, really messed with them. So the nice part about HRV and having the qualitative indicators is you can go back and look for that particular individual and their nervous system and their environment. What are the things that are most stressful to them? And so I've noticed huge differences in nutrition. I've had some people eat what I would consider just utter crap and still do pretty good. Granted, we still work on nutrition with them, but that's paradoxically not where I started. One thing that has shown up in every single person I've ever tested to some degree is actually sleep. So, which makes sense, but I haven't found a single person yet, and I'm sure one probably exists, where their sleep was not affecting their HRV. Meaning that if they were getting 6 hours a night and they report that they're good and their performance is pretty good, if we could wave our magic wand and get them to 8 hours a night, HRV goes up, performance goes up, right? So even the people who were doing well, higher quality sleep, they still ended up doing better. So the other part I've been playing around with lately more is breathing stuff, as Simon mentioned. So I think if we look at a priority of survival, breathing is pretty much right up at the top of the list. So I've been more interested lately on, like Simon's experiment, different breathing things we can do that will have a long-term change in HRV and just drop their overall level of stress.
Right. Thanks. Marco, just quickly, your app is somewhat different from Simon's. Do you want to just give a little, just a quick overview of some of the other features that you have on there? And do you? I'll come to Simon on this with the release of his coaching platform. Do you have anything similar in terms of if you had a coach who wants to work with athletes who are all using your app, that there's a way to correlate that or an overview of that? Oh, your mic is...
I think your mic is off there, Marco.
Sorry, guys, because they're doing some road wars and I didn't want to annoy you before. So yeah, we do have a coach app where basically a coach would add all athletes and monitor them remotely. So that's mainly for convenience. And you would get everything in there. Also export all the data easily, because what we find typically when we work with teams is that, especially big teams with many sports scientists, they use HRV as one of the many metrics they measure. So they like eventually, to gather all the data from all the tools and make, their own tools to process this data. So, easy export, and you can run different analysis in these apps as well. I guess maybe one of the main differences, apart from the camera measurement, is some of the insights we are trying to build on top of the single measurements. So something that will start showing up after you have enough data. So 20 to 50 days, depending on the different insights. So we have one of the most interesting to me is this trend analysis. So where we try to look really at the big picture and automatically determine what are your recent trends, your baseline HRV, but also this normalized HRV we were talking about before, which might have to do with saturation. At the same time, as Simon was talking about the coefficient of variation, so you expect things to jump around less when you adapt well to your training plan. At the same time, when that happens and you are in a phase in which you're not training much, it could be related to overtraining again. So we look at all these variables and try to come up with an understanding of what's the situation for a specific athlete. So if you are coping well, if you are accumulating fatigue and these kind of things. We do analysis of acute HRV changes, which means basically how do you respond on average to trainings that are for you intense, subjectively underrated as intense, or your average trainings or your easy trainings. So you can look at that for the past 60, 90 days and try to see if you see reflected in your HRV or heart rate the different intensities of these trainings, which might then help you understand if you can adapt your training based on this data. And then what else? Correlations that you can run in the app, so you can use all the variables that you tag in the morning, to give some context around your measurement, because all this data without context doesn't tell you much. So again, sleep quality, as I think Mike was saying, always a factor which is highly correlated with HRV, which again makes a lot of sense, because if you don't rest well, you're physiologically more tired, and also of course sort of other variables that you can annotate. And I would say that's more or less the kind of analysis we try to provide, together with the more standard training load analysis and acute and chronic load and injury risk, which is not based on physiological data, but I think it's things that we try to bring together, as both of them are obviously very important in trying to optimize your training, by using standard models which account for what's been your recent load and how is your physiology responding basically to that.
Right. So just to be clear, when people are putting in their subjective measures in your app, does it actually affect recommendations, or is it just correlative data?
So you get a number which is just HRV based, but you get also an advice which is a combination of your HRV score, your recent trends, and also some subjective variables like sleep quality or muscle soreness, your perceived performance in the past few trainings. So we put together a bunch of variables in the past few days and combine your subjective score with your daily HRV to get to the final advice that the app gives you.
Right. And Simon, does ithlete do the same thing with its subjective measures?
Yeah, so we're recording subjectives at the moment, and we started a study last year with the University of Edinburgh, not with physiologists this time, but with the informatics group. So they're applied statisticians and people who are experts on machine learning. And what we're doing at the moment is basically seeing what it is from training load and other subjectives that we can really take away, not just in a correlation sense, but in terms of training a model to be able to make sense of the data overall to determine, what's really there as a signal and what's there as noise. But overall, what we're trying to do is to provide a tool which can be used on a couple of different levels. So the range of sophistication of users varies quite a bit, and so does the learning curve. So we don't want to put everybody in at the deep end. What we want to do is give people a tool that they can initially try, in a simple way using finger sensor, and then they can get a traffic light indicator. So they're green, they're good to go today, an amber or a red. And the amber and the red take into account both heart rate as well as HRV. And then, as they progress, they can look at trends, they can look at more data. And within ithlete Pro, what we're doing is we're basically adding more widgets to ithlete Pro, which will do further degrees of analysis. And that ithlete Pro stuff is also visible in the new app that we launched today, ithlete Coach, which has actually got, it's had a really good reception so far, and it's being used by some pretty serious coaches, actually, of some world-class athletes, which I was very pleasantly surprised about. And having something which is quick to look at, if you've got a number of athletes on your books, and you can do sort of, you can check by exception, and you can use it on a number of different levels. That's always been important to us, and that continues to be important.
Great, great. I think because we've gone over time by about 25 minutes. But guys, thanks so much for this. I hope for the listeners we've covered a lot here. I'm certainly sure that if anyone wants anything more specific answered or talked about from people who've got years of experience now with HRV, both on a practitioner level and on a technical side, do let me know on my site, useful.coach. There's a discuss box there. Put stuff in there, and I'm sure I can organize another discussion with these three guys. Certainly, I want to try and get hold of Joel Jameson. Andrew Flatt couldn't be with us. He was getting married and also becoming a doctor. So he was busy. But certainly we can bring some more people into this and have dig in deeper. HRV is really fascinating. Mike put me onto it, I think, a week after I had just bought the ithlete app, and it's been fascinating, and I discovered things all the time. Certainly working with clients, this is even more fascinating, and just seeing how HRV is something that I think is very useful in picking up and guiding the coaching practice. So guys, I don't know if there's if you just want to do some closing thoughts, and then we'll call this a day.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I mean, if anyone has any questions for me, it's just miketnelson.com, or they can just email me directly at drmike@miketnelson.com. Just put in the subject line @action HRV, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Mm-hmm.
Anything from you, Marco?
Yeah, no, nothing to add. I think people can find me on the HRV for Training website and blog, and we have a contact there, so always happy to engage in conversations around this.
And Simon, where can we find you, and what is your plans for the future?
Sure. Well, anyone can find me at my email address, which is simon@myithlete.com, or there's a couple of different places for contact us forms on the myithlete.com website. Plans for the future are to just make this tool available to more people. What we really like doing on the website is to try and summarize research and provide resources in an accessible form that people can learn more about this fascinating index. And also thanks to you, Tom, for not only organizing this, but for doing the articles you have, which have been popular and well received. So I think doing a good job, everybody here, in fact, of spreading the word and doing it in a good way.
Great, Great. And from my side, so I'm working with a couple of climbers now, and I'm always welcome to take on anybody else. You know, ping me an email, tom@useful.coach, if you are a climber, and we'll get you hooked up with HRV, and we can start seeing if we can get some data on climbers in that sense. Guys, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I know it's all different time zones. But thank you so much, and have a good evening and a good day. We'll catch up again soon.
Will do. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Tom.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. See ya.